Travel on a Tuesday. How's everyone doing today? Sorry for the delay in getting out here. As mentioned, uh, I was traveling today. Should be back to our normal schedule for the day. Friday, I'm going to be traveling to Minneapolis and therefore not streaming. I'm going to be in Minneapolis for the whole week after that. So I'm going to not stream next week either, which means that our next broadcast will be back. Oh boy. When is that? Our next broadcast is going to be on June 3rd, which will be one of our monthly broadcasts as opposed to a lesson-specific broadcast. We'll throw in the lesson-specific broadcasts, probably scatter them throughout that week, probably just run one Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, just so we can catch up, because we're going to have a lot of material to catch up on. With that being said, how's everyone doing at this slightly later than usual time frame? Gentle Giant says, wait, you'll be in Minneapolis? That's a shock. Alright, Gentle Giant 303, I know who you are and I know what you're doing in Minneapolis, and I can change that, because I wrote the schedule. But nah, it'll be good to see a bunch of folks in Minneapolis. It was great seeing folks in Richmond, and I'm excited to see more folks, or some of the same folks again in Minneapolis in like 4 days. Time is soon. Yeah, time is... Anyways, today we have two big categories that we're going to cover. We're going to be covering part 2 of communication, which is going to be out-of-order sequencing, shortcuts, and the ever-classic reversing decisions. I'm sure nobody has any questions about reversing decisions. And then later on in the broadcast, we're going to just dive into the general philosophy of the master event document. But let's just dive right in. If anybody has any questions, of course, as always, feel free to drop those in the chat and I'll take a look at them. Probably in the middle of a sentence, get stun locked, and then finish what I'm saying and go back to your question. So, as we talked about last time, we started to discuss communication and expectations there. And today we are going to continue to discuss out-of-order sequencing and communication and that sort of thing. Tennessee Feet Monk, can I explain the intent behind the reversing decisions policy? Yes, when we get there. The other two are relatively straightforward, so we'll save that until we get to that point. Dino Ari, to answer your question, I can't answer that, and neither can scientists. But out-of-order sequencing, this is also known sometimes as OOS. This is when you do stuff out of order, but everything is still not perfectly legal, but legal enough that we don't have to care. I think one of the most frequent examples, an example I use in the lesson itself, is a player readies their resources and then resources during regroup, or resources a card from their hand, then draws for regroup. Technically, those actions are illegal. Practically, they've gained no advantage. They've gained no information. Nothing has changed about the game state. They're really just limiting their own information, giving their opponent a little bit more information. And the game ends up in a totally legal state. And so while there was a transitionary period where we weren't in a legal state, we got there in the end. That also means that there are a few other examples. One of the is the classic draw then discard that's handled out of order. If you're going to be playing Palpatine's Return or Salvage and you know what card you're going to want to get back with those effects, and you resolve a draw then discard effect, it's totally fine if a player discards first then draws. However, the inverse, where a player is instructed to discard then draw, doing that out of order is not okay, because if you draw first, you will have extra cards in hand when making that discard decision, which is something that we want to avoid. So that means that it's just relatively straightforward. If a player gains no information in the process, no advantage from doing things out of order, and the game ends in a correct and legal state, doing things out of order is A-okay. Sertar asks, do you prefer breaks in team with no breaks team with coordination so we don't have all the team leads gone at the same time, or scheduled? That is a longer conversation. I prefer scheduled breaks just because having a plan in place makes it easier to think on the fly than develop a plan on the fly and then when it breaks, fix it. Having any amount of work done beforehand, like you could build your, this is a huge tangent, you could build your schedule the morning of and tell people this is what you're doing, this is the role you're going to be in, and then when it breaks down throughout the day and you have to change things, you can build that change in and continue to evolve it. And some people might be like, well, that's just saving you work because you're not working in advance, you just have it go. But having that structure to build off of and the core to return to and that underlying plan to return to gives you, I think, a stronger foundation. But I have a handful of other examples for out-of-order sequencing. Gentle Giant 303, what does that have to do with player communication? Absolutely nothing, but it was in the chat, and I'm nothing if not susceptible to tangents, like the question that you asked. What does that have to do with player communication? I'm sorry, we're a little bit spicy today. So, other examples of out-of-order sequencing, resolving a when defeated trigger a little bit later than you should have, as long as you've made it clear. If you, for example, or potentially earlier than you should have. For example, you have on attack, draw a card, and when defeated, deal 2 damage to a unit. You go ahead and attack. You know your unit's going to die. You're going to say, attack, trade these. This is going to be defeated, and I'm going to send the 2 damage over there. And then you draw the card. Again, we haven't gained information before we're supposed to gain the information. We've just done something else a little bit earlier. If those were inverted, and so you had on attack, deal 2 damage, when defeated, draw a card, you need to resolve those in order, because the drawing the card gives you extra information. And so seeing, oh, now I have a takedown, that means I'm going to want to hit the 7 health unit. That, because obviously changing the lines of play by doing this out of order, that's not legal. And so any sort of out of order sequencing, just hand wave it and move on. Sertar says, Oos is used every time a player resolves all of U-Wing reinforcements before putting the event into discard. Yep. Oos is used every time somebody plays U-Wing reinforcements and resolves or reveals all of the units that they're going to play before playing the first one. It's technically reveal, play, reveal, play, reveal, play. If cards are played before cards from U-Wing are put on the bottom of the deck, again, out of order sequencing. It's really just to say, if it doesn't matter, we don't care. It's just a formal way of saying that. Shortcuts take a step further into complexity. Shortcuts are when a player takes an action or batch of actions, but doesn't lay them all out one step at a time, and just jumps to the end of the sequence. So looking at U-Wing again, if it's U-Wing play these 3 units, those should technically be played one at a time and resolved one at a time. But if there's no triggers that need to be resolved, or even if there are, you can just throw them all into play as long as that shortcut doesn't change what you do. For example, if all of the when played are draw cards, put experience counters on things, heal your base, that sort of thing, you can just plop them out and say, heal 1, draw a card, put an experience counter on this, and you just do those things all as a big batch rather than play 1, draw, play 1, heal, play 1, experience. Out of order sequencing and shortcuts just allow us to communicate a little bit more smoothly. The intention of shortcut policy and out of order sequencing policy is to match how players play the game. Players don't play technically perfectly. 1, because they don't know how to, but 2, because playing technically perfectly is a pain in the butt. I want you to imagine playing a couple of rounds of technically perfect play where when you play a card, you're going to say, okay, I am playing this card. Cost is 2. There are no cost modifiers, so it will cost 2 resources. I'm going to exhaust these 2 resources. I am now playing this card. It is now resolving. I have a when played of trigger. Just that for a game. Also, Spec Force Soldier costs 1, not 2. My memory doesn't serve me well sometimes. But that level of technicality makes the game unplayable. Gentle Giant 303 says everyone should try it, see how quickly you want to never play a game again. Yeah. I do recommend it, playing that technically perfect game, to understand why these communication policies exist, why out-of-order sequencing and shortcuts, and even reversing decisions exist. Because players aren't going to be perfect, and you wouldn't want them to be, because it would make every matchup take 2, 3, 4 times longer. And so we'd be playing 4-hour single rounds. But we can create policy to say, this stuff is fine. These lapses of communication are entirely okay and expected. But going back to shortcuts, there aren't a ton of shortcuts in communication that are inherent to the game. Some other games are, but let's see. One is readying your resources during regroup. That generally communicates to your opponent, without you saying anything, I have finished making my resourcing decisions. If you are watching somebody play and they draw 2, they look at their hand, they think for a second, and then they ready their resources and units, most players will assume that player has decided not to resource. Just because readying stuff indicates I have completed this step and I am moving on, even if the player doesn't say anything. Now, notably, players can verbally deny a resource. A lot of people do ready before resourcing, and that's why being like, hey, I'm still resourcing or still thinking about it. I think something that I see a lot of people do is ready their resources but not their units, because they're stuck in that middle place of, right, I'm not supposed to actually ready these yet, but I'm not going to exhaust them again because that's silly. I'm going to think and then I'm going to finish readying my units. But this one also isn't factual. You can just be like, hey, I'm still thinking, haven't resourced yet. And that turns back into out-of-order sequencing, where readying your resources before resourcing a card for turn doesn't really matter. Other potential shortcuts are, the process of playing a card, rather than saying all of the steps, you just say, I'm playing the card. If you have a card that targets only targets players, and it's generally detrimental effect, in a 2-player game, will generally be assumed to be targeting your opponent. If you have a card that says, choose a player, that player discards 2 cards, you don't generally have to say, hey, opponent, I want you to discard 2. You can just play that and say, I'm playing this, discard 2. You don't need to explicitly declare that target, because the target can be generally assumed. If you want to target yourself, be like, hey, I'm targeting myself. Something that will happen is that players will, over the course of a match with a particular opponent, develop shortcuts that are particular to that match. For example, the way people resource might become a developed pattern, where the players ready their resources and then draw and resource, or they do that in the technically correct order, whatever it is. That pattern that players establish is important to how we proceed with the game. Because while there's guidelines and a lot of information about how players communicate and how players should communicate, again, this out-of-order sequencing policy, the shortcuts policy, the loops policy, even reversing decisions policy, is based on how players communicate. And when players deviate from the standard of communication, that's when things get a little bit complicated. But you also, players are allowed to do that. We don't have very rigid rules on communication because that allows a broader culture, broader community to play the game. It makes it a little bit more approachable. And so all of these things are guidelines, not hard and fast rules. So we're going to, Hero Zap, I see your question. Once we get to reversing decisions, I'll read it and go over it. Because before we do, I just want to talk about loops very quickly. Loops can be involved in more complicated shortcuts. One of the few loops that exists in the game is a player with Sandhill, chairman of the Banking Clan, which has on attack ready resources equal to the number of, or up to the number of units, friendly units that were defeated this phase. Admiral Mahdi, which says when defeated, ready a villainous unit, which includes Sandhill. And then Admiral Trench, which has exploit, and when defeated, return some number of units that were defeated this phase from your discard to your hand. With 2 Admiral Trenches and Admiral Mahdi and enough starting resources, you're able to play 1 trench, exploiting Admiral Mahdi, readying Sandhill, defeating your other Admiral Trench, which returns Admiral Mahdi, or it's a when played on Admiral Trench, not a when defeated. So you play it, defeat your other Admiral Trench to the uniqueness rule, get back Admiral Trench and Mahdi, use the resources, attack with Sandhill, ready some resources, use those resources to play Admiral Mahdi and Trench, and just do this over and over again. This loop can be shortcut to say, once you get to a point where you're like, at this point, when I attack with Sandhill, I ready more resources than it costs to play both Mahdi and Admiral Trench. I can do this an arbitrary number of times. And you can say, I'm going to do this 5 times and deal 15 damage to your base, or something along those lines. Loops are just a sequence of events where you end up in the same game state with generally 1 or 2 variables changed. For example, you can always add cards to this engine, to this loop. If you added in a Admiral Yularen from Spark of Rebellion, whenever you play a command unit, I believe it's heal your base for 1, you'd be able to put in an arbitrary amount of healing. If you had other effects that, say, for example, on playing an Imperial unit, get an experience token somewhere, or something along those lines, you'd be able to do those things an arbitrarily large number of times as well. And so even if, like, Sandhill had 0 power, you'd still be able to get some value, and you'd be able to say, I'm going to do this n times until my base is fully healed, until your base is defeated, until all of your units are defeated, until whatever condition. And then you don't have to go through each of those steps, as long as both players understand and accept the shortcut of, we start here, we end here. And so you generally have to demonstrate your loop at least once or twice to explain to your opponent, hey, this is what I'm doing. Of course, if the Sandhill Double Admiral deck becomes super meta and everybody knows it, you just say, I do the combo, you die, and your opponent's like, yep, you got me. And you don't have to go through each of those steps. Again, communication is based on what the players are talking about and what they're doing. So, now we get to the fun part. I'm going to scroll up real fast to start with Tennessee Feet Monk. Can you explain the intent behind the reversing decisions policy? Yep. So I talk about the reversing decisions policy a little bit in this lesson. And the idea is that, let's say a player has in hand a card and they're like, vanquish, no wait, take down, and they never reveal a card, they don't exhaust any resources, there's no evidence other than them saying out loud vanquish that they are planning on playing vanquish. And then you look at their hand and they don't actually even have a vanquish, they have a takedown, they just misspoke. What do we do here? Do we issue this player a gameplay disruption for playing the wrong card because they said vanquish but played takedown, even though they didn't have a vanquish in hand. Issuing a penalty for misspeaking is clearly not appropriate. That would just make it so that players players would become very frustrated with judges very quickly, and rules lawyery players, angle shooters, would be like, judge, my opponent misspoke, I would like them to get a penalty now. And so that is clearly a case of miscommunication. If a player says, attack no wait, it can't attack this phase because of some other effect. Again, we're probably not going to penalize that player because they caught themselves before they did something illegal. So if they're about, like, in both of these cases, the player is trying to do something that they're not able to do. They're saying they're going to do something that they're not able to do. And so in those cases where they catch themselves and it's very clear, I'm not even going to try, like, I haven't shown you the card, I haven't exhausted any resources, I'm not actually trying to cast Vanquish here. No infraction, no penalty, they haven't done anything wrong. If you agree with that, then you agree that there is a line where a player can say that they're going to take a particular line of play and then walk it back. So the next question is, where is that line? Is it when they reveal a card? Is it when they exhaust resources? Is it when they are no longer touching the card? If we agree that players should be allowed to take back some action sometimes, even under very specific circumstances, like in these examples where they announce something, they haven't touched any resources, they haven't shown anything, then we agree that there needs to be a line defined somewhere. We can define the line based on physical action. Like, if you reveal the card, you're locked in. However, that doesn't really work for attacking with units because the card is already revealed. So it's, if the player touches the card, that means that they're locked into attacking it. What if they don't say anything and they touch a unit and then they don't touch a unit? So it can't be just touch. That doesn't really make sense. We could just say, once you say something, we're going to hold you to it, but that doesn't work for things where players accidentally miscommunicate, like somebody says vanquish when they have takedown in play, or all of the TIE fighters that look identical from Jump to Lightspeed. There are a couple at the lower end that just look very similar, and if players playing limited, it'd be very easy to confuse the two of them and just name the wrong one. And having players being beholden to exactly what they say when miscommunication is so easy would lead to a lot of frustrated players and an adversarial relationship between players and judges. And our job as judges is to make sure players have fun. That's our job. Now, we do that through making sure that play is fair, among other things. But if we are seen to be overly aggressive on things that don't impact the game, we lose a lot of credibility with the community. So, we're not doing you touch the card, because that just doesn't work, because you touch cards all the time. Having it be a mix of like communication and touching cards is a little bit messy. One of the goals is to test the player's skill, right? So let's say it is as soon as you let go of the card, you're locked into it. You're like, I'm gonna vanquish that, and you're still holding the card, and your opponent says, okay, vanquish doesn't, like, Relentless says the text doesn't matter. Or you say, make this attack, and you're like, okay, remember it has the +1/+1 from General Dodon. And they're like, oh, right, this is a bad attack. They're still touching the card. Do we let them take that back? That feels worse in my mind, because of the information gained. And so we can't have it just be physical contact, right? Because a lot of information can be gained, and that really changes how a player makes a play. And so we are using policy that is derived from the policy in Magic the Gathering and Flesh and Blood of, if you gained information since your action from your opponent, you're not allowed to take back that action because we want you to make this decision on your own. So if you go, I'm going to play Vanquish, oh wait, that's a terrible play, I'm not going to do that, before your opponent has said anything or done anything, we're going to let you take back that action. So the line was drawn because there needs to be a line somewhere. And we choose the line of information because even though that is a hairy line sometimes, it fits the philosophy of we want you, the player, to be making these decisions yourself. And so if there's no new information gained, no communication from your opponent, you've made this realization yourself. If you have gained information, then you are not necessarily making this decision in a vacuum. Another reason for reversing decisions policy is it allows players to play just a little bit faster. It lets them say, okay, I'm 99% sure that this is the play. I'm just going to say Spec Force Soldier, that loses Sentinel. Rather than waiting and going through that extra layer of processing. If there's no takebacks at all, players have to be a lot sharper in their communication and think much harder. Tennessee Feet Monk says there's been a lot of disgruntlement around the take-back policy. Speaking intent and gained information seems to be a massive stumbling blocks. I don't recall this full of player confusion and backlash in Magic the Gathering. And Starkiller 07700 says Magic doesn't have the back and forth actions. There's a lot of frustration with player communication and takebacks in Magic. Takebacks are the most appealed call in my experience, handling appeals, because most of the time if a player says Spec Force Soldier, attack that, wait, no, can I take that back, their opponent says yeah, sure, because the opponent inherently recognizes this player has gained no information from me, they've realized they've made a bad play on their own, and with the goal of facilitating smooth play and friendly play, I'm going to let them take that back, because if I made a boneheaded mistake and wanted to take it back instantly as well, I'm sure that they would let me if I did, and if I said, no, you're not allowed to take that back, then I feel like they would be a little bit harsher with me. There's a sort of social contract to a lot of reversing decisions. And so those calls, which I am confident happen all the time because of the number of times it happens to me while I'm playing games where somebody's like, play this, no wait, I didn't want to do that, why did I do that, that was stupid, can I take that back, and I say sure, or I do the same. It happens constantly, even in high level competitive events, especially towards the end of long days or long weekends when people are tired and they get a little bit loopy, they make bad decisions and they catch them immediately, and players inherently recognize whether or not information has been gained. Sometimes they will be like, I think my opponent has gained information, and if you think that there's a chance that a player has gained information, decline them the option to reverse decision. I know another sticking point is one of time. If I go make an attack, deal 2 damage to that, kill your thing, and then we resolve that, right? Like, I attack, I deal my damage, and then you just sit there in silence thinking your move for 30 seconds, and then I realize, wait, that was a bad play, I want to take that back. If there's been no communication by this policy of has a player gained information, we're still fine, even though it's been a very long period of time. 30 seconds is egregious, but the policy cares about the information, not the time. Because again, if we put time as a requirement, we'd say, okay, after 5 seconds, you're no longer allowed to take back your decision, or 10 seconds or 15 seconds. That means that people start breaking out stopwatches, and it actually slows down the pace of play, and honestly doesn't come up that often, right? It's near, like, yes, that is a theoretical circumstance that can come up, but it's not a practical one, and developing policy to mitigate that feels less important, in part because the time isn't what we're concerned about. What we're concerned about is, did this player come to this realization on their own? So I want to take Hero Zap's question. In relation to taking decisions back, active player says, I kill that, or I trade here, and points at opponent's unit. The opponent says, okay, places damage on the unit because the unit actually didn't die. Let's say a Veers or Dodonna were out, or just plain and simple bad math. And the player says, oh, never mind, I'll take that back because it does not die like I thought. So this comes to what is information, and what is a legal play versus an illegal play. So I want to, before I get to what is information, I want to talk about legal plays and illegal plays. If a player does something illegal, we rewind that. And rewinds are judge actions to correct a game state, which is entirely separate from players reversing decisions. A player reversing decision 95 times out of 100 is them taking back the very last thing they did. Like, I don't want to make that attack, or I don't want to play this card. And that's just the one thing being undone. In a judge rewinding, it could be, hey, during your last turn, you attacked a non-sentinel. Well, there's a sentinel in play, you attacked their base. Since then, you resolved your triggers, your opponent has done stuff, and you've just played another unit. And in all of that, we as judges would undo all of those actions rather than just one. So reversing decisions and rewinding, even though they both involve undoing things that players have done, one is a player action based on, I didn't want to do that. I've realized independently that my play was a mistake, and I would like to take that singular play back. Generally singular play. A judge rewinding is something has gone wrong in this game, and the way we fix this is by going back in time to before the error was made and then resuming the game. So, for the example given by Hero Zap, this is information. Information can be an opponent pointing to an in-play effect that makes their decision a bad play but not an illegal one. So, if you say, attack and kill that, or 4 damage to that, players are allowed to do math incorrectly. But if you have a sentinel and you're like, you can't attack that, that is an illegal play and handled differently. If a player makes a comment like, I wasn't expecting that, a player reaches for their resources or goes digging in their discard, and the player looks and sees, oh, they have a Vader in their discard and I know they have a Palpatine's Return in hand, this was a bad play. The opponent going to the discard pile is information. Even though it's not verbalized, no action has been taken. If cards went from one hidden zone to another, even if the player didn't gain any information, like if a player resourced a card from hand to resource, that isn't something that we will undo for a player wanting to take back a decision, just because of the unverifiable nature of that. While that's not information, that is something that would preclude reversing decisions. Similarly, like if a player draws a card, that's very clearly information. If a player takes a card from their hand and puts it, like shuffles it into their deck, we can't very simply reverse that. We can do that if necessary for rewinds and judge action, but a player isn't going to be able to be like, yes, I'd like a random card out of my deck, please, to reverse this decision, because we don't want to allow people to just like ask for reshuffles or redraws. Starkiller says, what about the reverse, where the active player takes an action and the non-active player responds with a lethal action without resolving the previous action, then saying you can't take it back because you gained new information? So I'm not sure exactly what you mean here. Like, having an explicit example would be very valuable. If you mean, like, I say, attack and kill your thing, Um, and then I say, great, I'm going to attack and kill your thing. Because my unit didn't die. That's new information. Tennessee Feet Monk says, so taking an action, declaring intent, and the opponent informing them of something that gains information results in the play not being taken back. A few months ago, it was stated that declaring intent was one of the ways to always get a take back on an action that did not have the result that was stated, so I'm a little confused now. So there is a difference between stating intent and an illegal action. If you say attack your base and there is a sentinel in play, you have done, like, you are trying to do something illegal. And so that falls under rewinds, not reversing decisions. Similarly, if you say, like, I'm going to play timely and ambush out something, and you timely and ambush out something, like you tap 7 and ambush out Wrecker with timely, and your opponent's like, I have a relentless in play, your timely does nothing. You've done something illegal. You have resolved your timely, which is not legal. And so if you declare and do something illegal, then you get a reversal, a rewind. You don't get to reverse your decision. So you meant a legal action, for example, kill your Luke, but Dodonna in play, an opponent says Luke will not die. I think the effect there depends on what exactly you are doing. If I am trying to take down a Luke that is not, like, if I say take down Luke, and Luke isn't something that you can choose because it has too much health because of that Dodonna, that to me sounds like you are trying to do something illegal. If you are using open fire to defeat the Luke, that is legal and you have gained information and you're still locked into that play. If you're attacking Luke and you're like, yeah, attack Luke, attack and kill Luke, that is still legal, or legal to attempt in such a way. Yeah, I think in those situations, I may have communicated differently about reversing decisions. It's something that I've thought about extensively since it's become policy in other games. But if your intent is illegal, just flat out illegal, like takedown on Luke or vanquish on a leader, that gets undone not through reversing decisions but through rewinds, through gameplay disruption, if a judge is involved. But something like open fire or an attack that is not lethal but you think it is, that is still a legal play. Reversing decisions policy is always going to be hairy because it's about the edge cases of communication where players are trying to get angles. Story time. I had a call this weekend at a Magic event, and so I'm going to try and translate it into Star Wars language. But essentially somebody's like, if you have this card in hand, I'm dead, right? Like, oh, if you have a Millennium Falcon in hand, you can. I have 3 health remaining on my base. You'll be able to play it and then attack and kill me. Do you have a Millennium Falcon? And my opponent says, yeah, I have one. And they show me the Millennium Falcon. And then I say, are you going to play it? And my opponent says, yes. And I say, okay, cool. Vanquish your Falcon. But at this point, my opponent has not, while they have revealed the Falcon, they haven't put it down or exhausted the resources. The player who is playing the Falcon, now that they know that their opponent has a Vanquish in hand and makes the Falcon a bad play, it's like, I don't want to do that anymore. Should this player be allowed to take back their decision? Their opponent said, are you playing that? And they said yes. But they haven't actually exhausted any resources. They haven't, let's say, instead it's an event that readies a unit with power 3 or less. And they have multiple legal choices. Do we say, you're going to exhaust those resources and you're going to target the unit that we all know that you were going to target because that was lethal a second ago when you didn't know your opponent had Vanquish? This one was very tricky, and I chose to rule that the player with the Vanquish jumped the gun. Their opponent hadn't actually even begun the process. While they had said, yes, I'm going to play it, they hadn't used any resources. They hadn't chosen what they were going to be doing with it. And so I ruled that they had not, in fact, begun to, in Magic, cast the spell or play the relevant event. But that one is very borderline because the player did say that they were going to play it. On the other hand, in that situation, we don't know, for example, what resources the player might exhaust if they have multiple resources, and we can't force them. I can't, as a judge, be like, you're going to tap those resources. What if the players had done the math, both players had done the math wrong, and the player didn't have enough resources to play the card? We literally can't force them to play the card if they haven't begun that process. And so in some cases, declaring intent puts you into gameplay error or gameplay disruption. And other times, intent, like, it all depends on communication and in the moment what players are saying and what they're doing. It's also possible that players have developed this goes back to shortcuts. If players are treating defeat that as fact and not attack that, that can change how you rule. If every other time somebody said defeat that and their opponent said that's not actually lethal, and then this time they don't say anything, then we get into communication area, and you have to make a judgment call of, do you think that one player has intentionally communicated less in order to gain an advantage in a way that's malicious and unfair? So all that is to say, good luck. I'd want to take a look at wherever it was that I talked about intent. I know that it was discussed in I think it was discussed in the L1 channels relatively recent. It might have been rules and policy. But reading the things that were linked to me, it didn't feel like, I think that was what highlighted the issue between reversing decisions and rewinds. The difference between players being like, I want to take this back, and judges saying, we need to take this back. Sertar says, apparently there's a video from last October, pre-PQs. I wouldn't be, if it's a lesson, I want to address that. If it's a old broadcast, there's no way that I'm going to be able to excise that from history. But yeah, if everything is still legal, we look to information. If things are illegal, we look there instead. And intent doesn't really matter there. Intent matters for legal choices. It doesn't matter for takebacks. You'll also note that I mentioned a couple times that players can take back multiple things. So, for example, my opponent has claimed, and I go attack, 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 play General Dodonna. And then I'm like, wait a second, those were all rebels. I want to play General Dodonna first. My opponent, if they have just sat there and been a goldfish and done nothing, I am allowed to take back that batch of actions. A way to think about it is, this General Dodonna I just played, my opponent hasn't said anything, I haven't gained any information, because they've claimed the initiative, and so they've shown no interaction, etc. I can take back that. Now, the most recent card that I attacked with, have I gained any information since I attacked with that unit? No, so I can take that attack back. Now we go to attack number 2. Have I gained any information since I made that attack? Nope, haven't gained any information. Have I revealed information? Absolutely. But it's okay for a player to reveal information and want to take that back. They can't, like, Men in Black mind wipe their opponent, but they are allowed to undo actions where their opponent has gained information. This restriction on hasn't gained information applies only to the player who wants to take the take back. And so if you have a batch of actions, you can take them all back as long as you have gained no information from your opponent or other outside source during that window. Sertor says, did I miss your defining information? I talked about several things that are information, but really information is anything from a source, anything from your opponent that might make you change your mind. Anything outside of you and your opponent and outside of the game, like somebody saying something, that becomes outside assistant, and that's a whole different creature. But that's still information. But really, information is it's really gaining information from an outside source. If you are able to figure it out on your own and nobody else provided any information in the interim, you're fine. And so you being like, oh, Obi-Wan has a when defeated trigger, that's bad for me because you read the card, that's not gaining information. That's you realizing something. If your opponent says Obi-Wan has a when defeated trigger, that is you being given information. Yeah, if it's kind of silly, because if you read something that makes you go, oh, that's a problem, that is okay. If you hear something that is not okay, that is outside information. So if you read a card, cards in play are not information. I wouldn't say it came from outside your brain. I think that gets a little bit too existential too quickly, because like we're fine with you reading things as long as it's not like a sign from your opponent being like, hey, that has a trigger, especially given that there are some players who are deaf or hard of hearing who use written notes to communicate with their opponents. You being somebody writing down, that has a when defeated trigger, haha, you lose, that would still be information, even though that is you reading it. But you reading a card is not gaining information. You being pointed to a card is information. So if your opponent says, what about my Dodonna? And then you look at it and read it, now you've read it and that's fine, but your opponent pointed it out, so that is gaining information. Sertar says, can a spectator or judge leaning over a table be information? I think that it very possibly could be, because it is indicating somebody thinks something needs to... There's a question somebody has, and being like, somebody is confused by my play is information. Now, that can also be outside assistance in a way, just like somebody leaning over a table providing quiet information. Like, it doesn't have to be spoken. It can be visual only. So information is many, many, many things. And it is relatively easy unless the player taking back the action or who wants to take back the action does so immediately. It's very, very frequent that you'll say, no, you're not allowed to take that back. You have gained information. The information also doesn't have to be relevant to the decision at hand. For example, I could say, attack your base for 3. My opponent says claim. That doesn't say anything about the attack. That just says my opponent's next move is to claim. Now, even if they're exhausted out, all of their units are exhausted, all of their resources are exhausted, there's literally nothing they can do, and they say claim, that's information you've gained, because they could have passed. They could have passed. Now, would they strategically? Probably not. And so, even if the information feels silly or irrelevant, that can be information and be a reason to disallow reversing decisions. It's also easier to be strict on reversing decisions because most of the time the player who's like, I want to take this back, will accept, yeah, all right, I said I was going to do this. I'm not allowed to do this. But until education improves, either through the judge program and me directly, or through judges talking to players and players having experience with these calls, players are going to continue to feel blindsided. The player that I was talking about from this weekend with that reversing decisions baiting call felt confident that the ruling was going to be in their favor because their opponent had said that they were going to cast a spell, and that feels pretty conclusive, and revealing the card from their hand feels like they were revealing information. But the ruling was this player hasn't even cast the spell, and so you have simply revealed information before your opponent has made a decision. And so it's not even a reversing decisions, it's the player isn't locked in. And so that does mean that this stuff can be very complicated at times. And it's not something we're ever going to have clean answers on, and players are going to be not necessarily upset, but they will be frustrated or disappointed in calls, because when we get involved in reversing decisions, it's because the players don't just say, yeah, that's fine, go ahead. It's because there is a conflict of interest and a conflict of desire. Most judge calls we get, as I say in the lesson, are ones where players are cooperative, where both players want the same thing. Like, hey, judge, we accidentally, like, I attacked, we resolved combat, and then we realized that there's a sentinel in play. How do we fix this? And both players want the same thing. Both players want us to address and improve this situation. Or, hey, judge, realized that I haven't actually drawn cards for this regroup, and now we're halfway through the next action phase. What do I do when I'm 2 cards down? And the other player is also, yes, I would like this game state to get back to the correct state so we can have a natural outcome to our game. When it comes to reversing decisions, it's one player's like, in my opinion, I should be allowed to take it back. That seems fair. Another player says, my opinion is different, and I think the thing that you want is unfair. And both players believe that what they want is fair and what their opponent wants is unfair. Whereas, like, hey, I did something illegal and I want to fix it, or I want to know how these cards work, or we might have done something illegal and we want to understand that. In all of those situations, both players want the same thing. And even though they might be frustrated with each other, like, I think my opponent might have tried to sneak one by me, they want the game to be fixed, and their opponent, assuming that they're not a malicious cheater, also wants the game to be fixed and get back to playing. Whereas with reversing decisions, there isn't that shared belief of we want to fix the game and move on. It's we want diametrically opposed things, because otherwise we would have just done it ourselves. So reversing decisions is going to continue to be a thorn in our sides, at least for the next decade or two. As long as the game lasts, it's going to be a problem. But let's move on to talk about the master event document. in the master event document, we skip, in this conversation, we skip the event guidelines because we cover those pretty thoroughly in the level 1 lessons. And so this time, we're just going to be going relatively slowly and relatively thoroughly through the floor rules. We begin by talking about the introduction. It's just a paragraph or two that outlines how to use the floor rules. And essentially what it says is, when playing a game, people agree to play by the rules. And sometimes people violate those rules unintentionally. And these policies are designed to create a fair and enjoyable experience for all players, particularly when errors come up. It's a relatively straightforward philosophy of, we want to make sure that players have a fun time and a fair time. Something that isn't explicitly stated is that part of the goal is to make these consistent as well. You want it so that a player who plays in a planetary qualifier and qualifies for Galactics has the same experience at the Galactic Championship that they do at their local game store. That things get fixed in the same way, so that when a player makes an error, they know how it's going to be resolved, so they aren't surprised, so that things have known consequences. Having cause and effect for infractions and penalties, and we're going to talk about this a little bit more in Thursday's lesson, means that players will learn what they can and can't do. It's part of it is these infractions are designed to disincentivize bad behaviors that we don't want, and players knowing, if I do this and it is recognized, or I have done this and it's going to end up in a game loss, players will strive more to avoid things that are game losses than are warnings. But the floor rules cover 2 broad categories. That's what the rules say. It's really 3 broad categories. You have your gameplay disruptions, where a player does something wrong in the game. Event disruptions, where somebody does something that does not work within the confines of the tournament itself. And then unsporting conduct, which could be seen as a subcategory of event disruptions. It could it's in fact written as a category of event disruption, but really is its own class of inappropriate behavior. Being late to a match, having bad sleeves, having a poorly submitted deck list, all of those things are event disruptions and are very different than unsporting conduct and wildly inappropriate behavior. Understanding these documents and understanding the goals of these documents is hugely important. While we want you to know what to do and how to do it as written and not deviate, there will be situations where you need to deviate. But really the focus is consistently addressing common issues. That's what we're going to be focusing on L2, and getting that reflexive and understanding, this is how I fix a missed trigger, this is how I fix a missed gameplay step, this is how I fix something being underpaid for, overpaid for. Having that down makes it so that the play experience is smoother. You show up, player says, oh, I drew an extra card, you're gonna Spark of Rebellion, fix me opponent, here's my hand. Or player's like, hey, I accidentally looked at another card in my deck that I wasn't supposed to, I don't know the location of any cards in my deck. If they are able to answer the questions before we ask them, 1, that makes our life easier, but 2, it makes things just a little bit faster and gets them back to the game a little bit smoother. And again, that layer of consistency means that players aren't stressing out about judge calls as much because they know the outcome. Most fear is rooted in fear of the unknown, and so when a player makes a mistake, if they're like, I don't know if I'm going to get a warning, a game loss, get disqualified for this, I don't know what's going to happen, I am terrified, that leads to a less fun and enjoyable experience. Being scared for most people isn't enjoyable. Whereas if you know, oh, yeah, I screwed up my deck list, that's a game loss, and we move on from there, even though that's worse than a warning, you know what's going to happen, and so you can prepare for it. And when the judge comes back and they're like, hey, so you registered 47 cards, you're missing the 3 Sabines in your Sabine ECL list. We both know that they're Sabines, so I don't think you're cheating here. But this is going to be a game loss. And you're like, yep, I understand. So, what else do we have that we want to talk about? Yes. So these guidelines are guidelines. 99% of the time, for the vast majority of rulings, we're just going to follow the guidelines as written. But there will be places where it doesn't make sense, and we'll talk about how to deviate probably in a level 3 lesson that's quite some ways down the line. Something that I want to address, again, that's in the lesson, but we do want to remain vigilant for cheating. However, we need to temper that vigilance with respect and trust in our players. If we go into every judge call assuming that the player who made the mistake is cheating, is doing this maliciously, players will recognize that attitude, and they will feel persecuted and disrespected and not want to call judges. And that makes it easier for malicious actors to say, oh, sorry, I totally meant to tap or exhaust 8 resources for that. Sorry, here, let's just fix that. And we don't call a judge, and we don't gather evidence that this player is doing this thing repeatedly. Once judges are no longer trusted by the community, competitive play begins to fall apart very quickly, because you have cheaters realize that they can move in safely. You do want to be able to answer the question of why isn't this cheating when you do see an error, but you don't want... Striking the balance is very difficult. And you need to ask yourself a question of, how many innocent players am I willing to disqualify one cheater? Because you're never going to be 100% certain on whether or not you disqualified an innocent player or not. People who cheated will say that they didn't. It is important that, we'll talk about this more when we get to disqualifications, but it is important when you disqualify somebody, they understand why they're being disqualified. A lot of disqualifications are not because somebody did something illegal, but because they did the thing, realized it, and then didn't call attention to it. For example, player plays a card, plays a vigilance for 5 instead of 6 because they have an aspect penalty, and they realize it after it's resolved, and they've resolved another unit after the vigilance, and so they're like, oh, that didn't really impact the game. I would have played a 2-drop instead of a 3-drop. Next turn I'll just play the 2-drop instead of the 3-drop and leave a resource unexhausted, and that'll balance it out, and it's fine. A lot of players justify not calling a judge based on, I will penalize myself in some way. Like, oh, I drew an extra card? Well, I'll just resource it, or I'll just not play it. I won't call attention to it because I don't want to get a game loss. And if we catch those players in that error and are like, hey, how did you not realize that you were able to double cast Vigilance on this turn when you shouldn't have been able to do it for another turn or 2? That seems very obvious. Can you give me a story? And they don't have a reasonable story. And you end up disqualifying that player. The player may believe that they are being disqualified because of the error, not because they didn't call a judge about the error. And so you want to be very clear when you're removing a player from an event why you are doing so that they learn the proper lesson. But it's important that throughout all of this, always, you maintain respect for the players. Being investigated is tough. Having a judge suspect you of cheating is something that you will players will recognize, even if you are circumspect in your questions. And it will rattle them and throw them off their game and make them have a lesser experience. And part of our goal, as mentioned many, many times, is to make sure that they have a enjoyable experience. And being interrogated is not enjoyable. And there are a few consequences for players not enjoying their interactions with judges. One, cheaters thrive because players don't call judges. Outcomes will be less consistent because players fix things on their own without knowing policy. They're just like, we'll hand wave it. And so the outcome of results is muddied because the outcome of fixes is uncertain. And so it's very possible that just a very charismatic player is able to get beneficial or fixes that are more beneficial to them. Even if it's their opponent's errors, they're like, oh yeah, you drew an extra card, so just skip your next 2 draws. That'll balance it out. You have the 1 card now, you're down 2 cards later, that's fine. That's clearly a punitive remedy and something that we as judges would want to avoid. We generally want to avoid punitive remedies, and we'll talk about that on Thursday. But 3, TOs will see fewer calls because if players aren't calling judges, they will see fewer calls and therefore feel like they need to hire fewer judges, which leads to a spiral where cheaters thrive more, outcomes are less consistent, and the quality of play decreases over time. Now, moving on to talk a little bit more about the role of judge. It's important to remain impartial and objective, and equally important to be perceived as impartial and objective. Even if you know you're not going to treat your friends differently, being too casual with players, particularly in your local game store, when there are people you don't know, can put those newer players off. Because they see some people being in with the judges and think there might be some sort of bias or clique where the players in that clique always win. You, I am sure, have heard stories of the game store where the owner and his friends win every event or get all of the cool promos. Even if you've never been to a store like that, it is, if you're online, either in Discord, on Reddit, in Facebook groups, you'll have heard these horror stories. And so it's important to not only be impartial and objective, but to seem impartial and objective. Because if you don't, players don't trust you, they don't call you, and the issues from above mentioned. Potential Giant 303 says it's a hard thing to change your behavior, but it's important. Yeah. And if you're like, well, I don't want to stop being so friendly with all of my friends, great. That's entirely fine. Just be as friendly with people you don't know as well. That's not easy, says the introvert. And many of us have some degree of social anxiety or don't feel terribly comfortable making new friends. And if you have your group of friends and somebody else new comes in, being the proactive actor and being like, hey, I'm excited to have you here, that can be a challenge. But talking to those players and being welcoming to them and as welcoming to them as your regulars makes that person feel included. And so players won't think, oh, you're just going to give rulings in favor of your friends if you're friends with everybody. Or they might think that, but then they're like, wait, this judge is friends with me, so it's fine. Which is not ideal, but they're like, but we're friends and I trust them, and they're not going to make biased calls in my favor. Sartar says, I've trained my local players to call me judge instead of my name when at events. Yep, I've generally trained my local players. However, what's awkward is this past weekend, one of my friends' roommates was playing in the event, and this is somebody that I've had maybe 10 minutes of conversation with lifetime, and not somebody that I generally interact with at tournaments. I generally interact not even at game stores even, but at my friend's apartment. And they know who I am, and so they referred to me by name many times, even though I wasn't wearing my name badge the entire weekend, which was a little bit awkward here and there. But remain impartial, continue to be perceived as impartial. If you recognize that you aren't impartial, recuse yourself, or if you're the only judge there, because that's frequently how it is at the local level, talk to individuals or sources who you trust to be impartial. Talk to other judges there, the tournament organizer. You can reach out to other entities like through the judge Discord, be like, hey, I have this thing where I'm making a ruling against my friend or at a table with my friend, and I know that I'm not objective in this way, and I have concerns about that. And having somebody else be like, nah, what you're saying is entirely correct, issue the ruling and move on, can help you just be like, okay, good. I now know that I'm calibrated correctly in this interaction. My final point is about mistakes. Judges will make mistakes. We're people. We will misread things. We'll mishear things. We will simply not know things. We will think we know things and be wrong about knowing things. But it's how the mistakes are handled that is important. The immediate response, if you've given an incorrect ruling, go to where you gave that ruling and identify if it is possible to pause the game, if your ruling has done damage to the match. You can pull the players away from the match and be like, hey, you know that ruling I just gave about Avenger, has that come up, or is that something that you just wanted to know for potential future plays? Have you made decisions based on my ruling? Has the game changed because of what I said? And if the answer is no, you say, okay, good. My ruling was wrong. Here's the correct information, if you're able to provide that. And then return them to their game, give them a time extension, have them play on. If you do cause damage to the game, you want to talk with the head judge. The head judge might be you. It might be tournament organizer. But you can essentially treat a judge error as a gameplay disruption. And just be like, okay, let's rewind through this. Or I said that it wouldn't get the counter, but it does. Let's just give that extra counter. Oh, and you attacked with it once. Great, let's do that extra point of damage that it should be there. You should fix your mistakes like you would fix a player's mistakes. You don't get penalty points, but it doesn't hurt for you to keep track of your errors so you know your areas of growth. We don't issue game losses or match losses ever for a judge error. If you have screwed up, the onus is on you to fix it, not to say I can get rid of this by making somebody lose the game. It is inappropriate to penalize players for your errors. Now, keep in mind that the player does have the opportunity to appeal. And so if you give a ruling and it's wrong, and the player says, I'm not sure about that, go ahead and double check into the comprehensive rules, or check with another judge, or consult with the head judge if you have a head judge, if it's a larger event, or an appeals judge if it's a large enough event. However, if a player's like, I think that's wrong, but they don't say anything and they just accept the ruling, and they provide absolutely no pushback, and the game proceeds and there's error, you can take that into account. Similarly, if they do appeal and the head judge comes over and agrees with your ruling, or you look it up in the CR and you look in the CR, the clarifications, and you're like, yep, this is what it says, I'm 100% confident, and then 5 minutes later somebody's like, you're talking to somebody, you're like, yeah, I had this really weird call, we were like, this is what I looked up and this is what it says, and they're like, actually there's been a new, more recent clarification, or you, I think, are looking at the old rules because that was updated for Jump to Lightspeed or Legends of the Force, and then you look up whatever it is and you're like, oh, I was wrong. You can take into account, again, like, we looked this up and this was an incorrect ruling, and maybe your ruling ends up being, this ruling is going to stand for the rest of this match, future, or the rest of this game. We're going to address it in the future if you just can't fix it. There are things that you can do to make up for errors with players. Once you've made a decision, once you've gotten the game back to playing, once you're able to center yourself. Figure out how you're not going to make that mistake again. Sometimes it's, I've made that mistake once, I now have this knowledge, I'm not going to make that mistake again, I now know how this works. But that's not true for everybody. And so taking the time to learn, and how are you going to study in the future? Like, what will you do to prevent this error or even a similar error from occurring in the future is part of how you handle this. That's about it for this episode. We'll be back, as mentioned, June 3rd, after we've had 4 more lessons, I believe. So it's going to be quite some time, and whenever that broadcast comes up, if we're not doing just the Q&A, we're doing the Q&A and lessons, it'll be a long one. So unless anybody has any questions, that's going to be it from me for quite a little bit of time. If you're going to be in Minneapolis, I'll see you this weekend. If you're not going to be in Minneapolis, I won't see you this weekend. Tennessee Feet Monk says, off topic, is there a time frame for L2 endorsements from TOs? The goal is to have the endorsement system set up and ready to go, which includes competitive TO role for tournament organizers by the end of June, beginning of July, so a month in advance of the exam, which will be more window than we had between L1 endorsements and L1 exam. We're also going to have more organizations that will have the ability to endorse level 2 judges than we did when we launched the L1 process. So we should have an easier time of that. Everything should be a little bit smoother. With that, thank you all for joining me. I'll see you in the next one. Good luck and have fun.